now it's my great pleasure to introduce James Bullion, President of ADAS and Executive Director of Social Services for Norfolk County Council. I've known James for some time and was delighted when just over a few weeks ago James took over the presidency of ADAS and also took the time and has taken the time to be with us today. I know he's been busy. I know just on a conversation we were having yesterday preparing for today, he was busily on his way on the upper London street to do an interview for Panorama and whatever. So James, really big thank you for joining us and spending your time with us. But having spent a year as Vice President, I'm sure, James, you couldn't have imagined you would be taking on a role in these circumstances which we find ourselves. And however typical of my experience of James has not only smoothly and calmly taken over the steering of ADAS during this period, he has quickly made a huge impression on the national agenda with government, key national media, as I've already mentioned, as well as the social care sector generally. And he's done all this showing his passion for social justice, which always shines through. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you, James.
Thank you very much, Neil, and good morning, everybody. It's a real delight to be with you at this housing event. And I want to echo my thanks to the Minister there for his appreciation of the role that local government and charities have made in stepping up to this task during COVID-19. And I think it's really important to emphasise the role of charities, and I'm pleased to see the funding going to colleagues as well as to specific initiatives. ADAS is a charity. Many of you will know that. Our members are the local authority directors of adult social services, their direct reports, and the principal social workers. And our vision is for a compassionate and respectful society that enables independence. And our priorities include sustainable, personalised healthcare and housing, good quality care from the care market, and increasing social justice. And when we talk about social justice, we really mean greater equality, power and control for people who've experienced disadvantage, discrimination in our care, health and housing system. In all the work we do, we try to promote a home first approach to support people so that they can be as independent as possible. And the fundamental importance of housing and home is applicable, we believe, regardless of your age, whether you are younger or older, disabled or frail. And it's an essential element of all of our lives. So fundamentally, we believe wherever you live, it should be treated as a home. I wanted to begin, though, by just acknowledging, as we meet and talk about reset and recovery and regeneration, it would be remiss of us, I think, not to reflect upon the devastating impact that COVID-19 has had on social care and on the people who use social care every day. And recently, ADAS carried out its normal annual budget survey, but this time in two parts. One survey concentrating on the impact of COVID-19 and another concentrating on the financial situation. And of course, we're all very aware of the devastating impact that COVID-19 has had on premature deaths. I think we now know that there have been 65,000 premature deaths as a result of COVID-19, and 27,000 of those have occurred in our care homes. So that's 13% of all of our residents have died as a result of the pandemic, which is a shocking figure. And of course, as well as the very sad premature deaths, we have those who've grieved in isolation, those who've been discharged from hospital, sometimes not with the right assessment, those who've been unable to access community services, those who are isolated or shielding, those requiring safeguarding or experiencing a crisis of mental health or addiction or domestic violence or exploitation, of course. And so what COVID-19 has done has really exposed the dreadful inequalities relating to people's mental health or their disability or other factors in their lives. And of course, for Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, we see the consequences of the poorer outcomes that were pre-existing before COVID-19 came along. And of course, whilst the wider population now is coming out of its hibernation and beginning life again. In social care, this will be a very different experience, and it will be with us for a long time as we ease the lockdown. And it's not just about opening doors, it's about restoring care and support and assessing needs and preparing inevitably for a surge in demand. In terms of that reset and recovery then, I think a few observations stand out for me. The task of adult social care was threefold: to protect people, to work with care providers so that they had stability, and to assist the NHS and protect the NHS with its discharges. And in terms of that NHS work, there was some success in supporting that. Some 25,000 people were discharged in a short period of time. We have to acknowledge the costs in doing that, both in the short term and in the longer term. And I think the example that's coming up from our colleagues in Bristol will cover some of that, some of the good practice associated with that. But the focus on rapid discharge without taking into account the wider needs of healthcare and housing has had some pretty tragic and impactful consequences, as has been now well publicised. And our own recent survey showed that only 11% of our directors were convinced that people had ended up in absolutely the right place for them in terms of their living condition. And we know that for some people, we found, of course, not only were they having challenging care needs, but they also did not have housing that was suitable to meet their needs. And this is something we realise all the time. Every care decision is a housing decision, but it really brings us, it really brings home to us when we do a mass event like this, that if we don't have the right adaptations and equipment and technology, this is incredibly important and makes the difference between having to go into an institutional setting or being able to go into a more homely environment. So COVID-19, I think, has reaffirmed for us that integration includes housing as well as health and the wider public sector. And we've found out that housing has played an increasingly important role in achieving protection for people. And I think we should think that through very carefully as we plan for our future, the safety of the environments that we live in going forwards. And we should not shy away from that issue of the number of people who have died recently, but neither should we seek to blame our care providers or their staff. And we should continue to work with people in social care and acknowledge the personal sacrifices that they've made. And we should make sure that every place where people are living is as safe as it can be. And that's with infection control and with all of the other changes that we need to make as we look forward to the next period. And crucially, we should think through what will have been the impact if we'd carried out those discharges about having greater access to, for example, extra care housing. How different would the experience have been? So to be in a position to do that, we have to think very differently about what is our offer going forwards. And in 2017, as many of you will know listening, the LGA published Residential Revolution, which estimated we already had a shortfall of 400,000 units of extra care housing by 2030. And this is not significantly improved since that research. We know that outside of London, only 22% of new homes being planned meet the minimum accessible and adaptable standards. And only 1% will be wheelchair accessible. So across all tenures, we need people to be living in accommodation that meets their needs, which are going to change. It takes time, obviously, to influence that planning, but we could have a better offer for older people. And if we could enable that, as the Minister said earlier, that will impact across the whole of our tenures. And it's really important that we get a commitment for that kind of change to take place. Of course, local authorities can't do that alone. We have to work with our partners and understand what the specialist housing need is And we have to understand particularly how learning disabilities and dementia and autism and mental health and drug and alcohol dependency, how those care and support needs need to be met in a housing context. So surely on the back of our recent experience, our legacy should be a major expansion of accessible housing and extra care housing for older people. Not only would that meet needs better, but it would help us with our economic recovery and the economic challenge that the country now faces. Taking a position that people should have the right to live in their own homes means that in addition to the physical housing, we have to have accessible health and social care services. How right is it that somebody with dementia should be forced to leave their home? How many care evictions, as I would call them, are taking place as a result of care needs not being suitable for housing? Is that a reasonable position that we are adopting as a nation? And of course, in social care, if we maximise independence and hold independence in high regard, it cannot be right that people are forced into a choice about their housing as a result of other limiting factors. It must be right that housing is at the centre of the decision making that we take on behalf of people and with people for their care needs. So I think we need a reset of housing rights. And I wonder about the rights of people in residential care. How empowered do they feel to say, this is my home and this is where I am going to stay? And so we of course have been working together magnificently, as the Minister acknowledged, to tackle homelessness and to rough sleeping across local authorities and across charities and with people themselves. And they've done an amazing job across the country in picking up this issue. In my area, Norfolk, a strong partnership has now emerged. We've rekindled and remembered our old supporting people mentality of coming together and thinking about how we can integrate ourselves around an issue. I do pay tribute to that, but I think we should pause and acknowledge that the problems we've had around housing within transforming care for learning disabled people, with rough sleeping, with supporting domestic abuse, the troubles we've had have been because of both fragmentation and a lack of funding and a lack of self-direction, I believe, for people. So nationally, adult social care, in my view, needs to be the subject of an industrial strategy to think about how we protect the care sector and expand the care sector in line with demography and in line with the changing nature of people's needs. Social care does deserve better. It's a growing sector. It can offer huge employment for people. And increasing housing supply has already been a government ambition coming out of COVID-19. This is likely to continue, as the Minister says, as a major economic driver as well as a care driver. Health has learned, with great respect to my NHS colleagues, that you cannot think about the NHS without thinking about social care, housing, and the wider determinants of people's health. So in summary, what ADAS with our partners will be taking forward is the opportunities that I've outlined. But I'd be interested in the views of this conference about our asks in ADAS. So our asks would be, I think, a major expansion of accessible housing and extra care housing for older people, a strengthening of people's housing rights, a properly funded partnership approach to housing as part of the Transforming Care programme, and to develop or redevelop partnership and funding approaches to wrap around housing support for services for vulnerable people. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, James. It's a shame we aren't in an auditorium where you could hear the applause, but virtual applause for James. I know James has a little while left with us, but then has to go off to introduce yet another conference in relation to skills for care and staffing, which is also, and workforce, which is also massively important to us. So we've got just a few minutes for any questions or comments. I noticed in one of the questions, James, there was a reference, when you referenced around planning and people saying about the engagement of planning. I think it was just before you taking over the sort of role of president, we held a round table, hosted a round table with England's chief planner, a guy called Steve Quartermain. But I just wondered if you want to say a little bit more about the recognition of the importance of planners and what we can do as leaders in local government to encourage sort of a greater collaboration with our planning colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Yes, thanks very much. It's a really important issue, and I was at that round table with Julie Ogley, the past president, and Steve. And after that meeting, I went away back to my own area to ask the question: how linked are we actually with our planning community? And of course, the links were there, but not very well flexed, and I think, or not very well used. So I think it's really crucial that we come up with a very strong partnership approach to planners. And what I've found in doing that is actually on the other end of that, a real willingness and a sort of hunger almost for gathering the evidence that is needed for local planning and gathering the sequencing the right partners in the process to make sure that that planning doesn't become a problem or a perceived problem. And I think it's often more perceived than it is real when it comes to doing the work. So it's an absolutely crucial area.
And a question from Jackie Snape, or well, comment really as well, about quite often people with a physical disability can be overlooked in the agenda if we're not careful. And I think that accessible housing issue is a massive issue, particularly and I think you referred a bit to it in terms of, in effect, what we might describe as mainstream housing in some way. So not necessarily always specialist housing, but the accessible part. And I think knowing your passion, as I said before, about social justice, I know that group of people aren't lost on you, but I don't know if you've got a bit of a comment about our focus on physical disability.
Yeah, I think when we call for a major expansion, we've got to really think about not just, as you say, the extra care, but the general accessibility issues. I mean, the statistics are a bit depressing, actually, about what the state that general housing is in. And I think I'll probably get this statistic wrong, but I think that most of the housing we've got for the future is here now. You know, we aren't going to build masses of new houses. It's pretty much here. So we've got to think about how can we make accessibility a main issue for disabled people. How do you do that? Partly it goes back to the planning issue. It certainly means that you have to give a voice to disabled people and include them in the process that you've got going on locally for housing and for transforming whatever care you're providing to people. And then I guess thirdly, you just got to make the case, the economic case actually, for why it makes sense to do that, because health, employment, other issues are made so much more efficient if you get the housing element of that right. It enables family carers to go and work, for example, rather than caring and so
on. And just a little comment from Anita around the sort of contribution of particularly of OTs and principal OTs, and she refers to the fact you mentioned principal social workers being now part of the membership of ADAS, but also to say we working with OTs generally, and certainly in the housing network that I chair on behalf of ADAS, the Royal College of Occupational Therapy is an integral part of that, and we supported them very recently on their adaptations without delay process to support that. But just a little comment around OTs, James.
Yeah, absolutely crucial. I mean, OTs, what's the statistic? 3% of the workforce, 30% of the caseload. And that tells you that actually the role of an OT in the broader social care family has a really deep impact both on people and their abilities, but also the way we do our work. And from a director who has to be concerned about money, of course, investing in the OT workforce and expanding that is an investor save proposition, because it absolutely saves you over-prescribing, if I'm allowed to say that phrase, and it gives particularly community OTs, although I don't want to disenfranchise anybody, but community OTs and their understanding of risk with people is really, really crucial in enabling the independence. So I'm fans of OTs. I love them, and we should have more of them.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. I'm afraid we've run out of time at this point, so just once again to thank you both for your time and your contribution and some thought-provoking asks of us, really, which both you and I will be delighted to get some comment and some affirmation, if you like, for some of those things, on nuancing from conference members across the day. And just before we move on, a comment from Steve Amos in the box there about saying he left housing in 2007 and we were talking the same narrative. Well, some of us we're talking about it a lot earlier than 2007, and yes, it does seem a little bit like some of the same narrative. But I think it's a bit like we were saying. The pandemic has been a horrible, terrible thing for us to have to go through. But there is an old phrase, isn't it, never waste a crisis, or whatever the phrase would be, in terms of there does now seem to be an appetite to really step up to the plate and make some step changes in some of the issues that as James said at the beginning of his speech, some of the inequalities, some of the things we're talking about were around pre-COVID, and what COVID has done is just really heightened them to a much greater extent, but perhaps opened up people to help find these solutions and perhaps those step changes in solutions. So point well made. But we'll move on. Thank you very much,